ですか？はい。Good afternoon, everyone. It's just 5 o'clock p.m. So I would like to start today's colloquium. I'm very glad. Thank you for joining our center's colloquium today. Before I introduce our guest speaker, please let me introduce the object of our center briefly. The object of our center is to contribute the advancement of academic research on Buddhist philosophy, history, and cultures, and other relevant fields. We tackle the goal based upon the firm academic discipline in Buddhism, which Ryukoku University has nurtured and developed since 1639. So we have a long history of the tradition of Buddhist studies in this school. Based upon this long tradition of Buddhist study, we challenge to explore Buddhist topics that meet the needs and concerns of our modern world through not only basic research, but also applied and interdisciplinary research projects. To achieve this aim, we would like to offer a global platform for the Buddhist study at the center. So we try to welcome researchers all over the world, and especially those who study in Japan from abroad. Our center is consisted of 3 divisions to organize research groups and conduct many research projects, which is a basic division, applied research division, and international research division. Each division has long-term research projects and mid or short-term research topics. Please refer to our website, and also we introduce our activities on Facebook and Twitter. Please check frequently to get to know our center. Today, we are very happy, honored, and very happy to have Professor George Keyworth as today's guest speaker. George Keyworth, Professor George Keyworth is our Numata fellow researcher, and he spent 5 months, right, at our school as a visiting researcher, and we conduct a co-project together with Professor George Keyworth. Please let me introduce George Keyworth's background. He received his PhD in Chinese Buddhist studies from the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Keyworth has published many peer-reviewed articles and chapters in books on the history of medieval Chinese and Japanese Buddhism. And recently, he works really, he works on the project of the Shogyo, which is the Japanese the document, sacred transmitted documents and books, especially in Kyoto and Nara. They are very, very precious and very, very important texts, and through his work, these information was shared outside of Japan. And I really, and because of that, he spent his time at Ryukoku together with Professor Abe, and we are trying to to develop this study at Ryukoku, and also share this information with other colleagues. So his topic is informed medieval monastic librarianship at atAmanosan Kongōji. What sacred transmitted documents and books Shogyo tell us we do not know about the history of medieval Eastern Asian Buddhism? It's a little bit long, but if you listen to his lecture, probably you will convince how much these documents and information are very important for the future, the Japanese Buddhist studies. So please, Dr. Professor George Keyworth.
Thank you very, very much for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So we're obviously doing this over Zoom, and we're also in the room together here at Ryukoku University, so it's a little bit different. I did slightly change the title of my talk, so I just corrected my own mistake. It's always good to start with a mistake. And that would be Shogyo, I think, are sacred teachings documents. Sometimes I forget. Anyway, obviously the Kyo would be teachings. Anyway, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here at Ryukoku University. And what I want to do is, if I can get my screen to change, there you go. I want to make some very special thanks. First and foremost to Professor Dake Mitsuya and the Ryukoku University Research Center for World Buddhist Cultures for hosting me and for organizing this presentation. I also want to give my sincere thanks to Professor Abe Yasuro for all of his intense help over the last few years and support. Dr. Saka Chihiro for setting all this up. It's never easy to do that over Zoom. And then a little bit from afar, I want to thank Professor Ochiai Toshinori for the support he's given me over many, many years, and we're about to see why that becomes quite relevant. Also, Professor Emeritus Goto Akio, Dr. Akatsuka Yudo, and then also I see on Zoom two colleagues, Stefan Duhl of the University of Hamburg, and also Brian Rupert, who is now in Yokohama. They are also tremendous teachers as well. And of course, our research never is complete without all of our teachers, and the list goes much further than this. Before I start, though, I want to say one thing, especially to the people in the room, but also over Zoom. My subject is libraries, and there is nothing quite like being in a library. And after the pandemic, the first time I walked into the Honkan over here, I sort of lost my breath because I was absolutely amazed. It had been so long since I had been in the space of a world-class library. And that's the subject we're talking about today, libraries. So the first thing I want us to remember, of course, is that when we think of libraries, and I'm sorry the screen's a little bit cut off there at the top, we're thinking about history of books and the history of libraries. And when we think about books, often, especially in English or French or German, most often, and also in Japanese, we're thinking an awful lot about European books. And scholarship, a little over a decade ago, and this is a figure that gets repeated very often, there's about 17,352 manuscripts in all of Europe that date to 501 of the Common Era to about 1500, so about the rise of the printing movement. And I think we would all agree that 15,000 is a lot. Kongōji's got 15,000, one library, okay? They're not quite as early as 501, but they're going to get pretty early. And I'm only talking about, I'm going to mention a lot of libraries today, but the scope of libraries in Japan, I think very often gets overlooked. We often think about Egypt in the history of books. We think about China in the history of books. We think about Greece. We think about Rome. But more often, I think we need to think about Japan, especially when it comes to the tradition of preserving libraries. And libraries, of course, in Europe mostly consist of, quote, among other things, Latin gospel books from the 5th to 8th centuries, 9th century monastic catalogs. Catalogs are very important, and Latin bestiaries. So I want to say something briefly about what that book is in the page there, because of course we're thinking about religious books here at Ryukoku University. We're thinking about Buddhist books. And of course that Latin Vulgate Bible which is, I'm not a Christian, so I apologize for phrasing it this way, but that's the Catholic Bible, okay, not the Protestant Bible we might see in English or other Western European languages. But this was the Bible in Greek originally, and then of course in Latin. As of 1592, that consisted of 76 books, 76 special books. And I think we all know that you can hold it in your hand. The Bible can be held in one hand, okay? That's a big book, but you can hold it in your hand, you can put it in your backpack. So you have a lot of copies of that one book, okay? Of course, 46 in the Old Testament, separated, that's the Hebrew Bible, 27 from the New Testament, and 3 from the so-called Apocrypha. So these are books that people have looked at over and over and over and over, and they still do. It's also important to note that when we think about monasteries and their libraries, especially in Europe, but also in Japan, they are powerhouses of prayer. An active scriptorium, a place where people copy and share books, depends upon a great library full of exemplars, many other books, and both require significant financial resources. Peasants in Europe had to work very hard to raise the sheep to make the parchment and produce the wealth to be consumed by the monks toiling away in the abbey's library and scriptorium. Here in Japan, we know about the production of paper and other things like that we obviously want to be thinking about. So when we're looking at a library, we're also thinking about a social and an economic situation. Excuse me. And I simply have a picture of Monte Amiata, which is near Siena, Tuscany. I'm sure we all are thinking of the beautiful weather in Tuscany right about now. Okay, my own current project that brings me to Ryukoku is to talk about indexing and cross-referencing books in medieval Japanese libraries. And of course, I could never even begin to do this all by myself, and it's a very long process. But as I'm going to talk about today, an awful lot of work has been done, especially over the last 20 years, maybe even 40 years, maybe even 50 years here in Japan. And most of those books are in print, but we're moving to a point where we can talk about Shingon, extant Tendai libraries, Pure Land libraries, Shin libraries, Nichiren, Hokkei, and also, of course, Zen libraries, about which we know a lot more in terms of the indexing, or at least most Western scholars are much more familiar with those. The initial stage of this very, very big project is to focus mostly on Kansai, but hopefully I'm going to initiate a conversation with Professor Chikamoto Kensuke as well in the near future to talk about some of his work he's doing in Kanto as well. But we're talking about getting some statistics and starting to cross-reference where's what, okay? And this is a strange thing because we haven't done this yet, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why. But I'm going to answer my own question first. It is a very long title, as Professor Dake suggested. It turns out Japanese libraries tell us an awful lot we do not know about Chinese and Korean Buddhist temple libraries. We have almost no idea what books were used by Chinese Buddhists, and we only have a slightly better idea from Korea, and I'm talking about the entire history of Chinese Buddhism. We have almost no idea how they cataloged their libraries, although we know China must have had hundreds, if not thousands. We have almost no idea what their educational curricula was. We don't know what they studied, what rituals they did, what books they studied to do those rituals. We have almost no idea from China, and we have much less of an idea for Korea in the early period, but as we move up into the Chosun period, it looks a little different. In opposition to this, we know a lot about pre-modern Japanese temple libraries. We know a lot about circa 20 or so that have been very well studied, and they provide a very good picture of the books preserved in those libraries and how the books were used. We have locally produced catalogs to specific libraries, much more like we would see in Europe, if we look historically. And then these libraries have numerous books about what to study and how to do that study. So the situation looks fundamentally different if we look at Japanese libraries versus Chinese or Korean. Dunhuang does not count. And the reason Dunhuang does not count is because we're not sure it was a library. Ooh, that's interesting. Anyway, we're getting a nice reverberation here in the room. Anyway, most documents from Dunhuang we know are actually from the Guiyi circuit time when just after the period of time Dunhuang was occupied by Tibetans. Of course, we do have a lot of wonderful materials that are older, and we have a few catalogs. And Professor Rong Xinjiang in particular has shown us those and made the claim that these are the catalogs to the library. And yet what we're looking at here is a nice list of Buddhist books that we all know a lot about, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. However, the order in this library doesn't look like any printed Buddhist canon ever in China, which is quite interesting. So a library, the one library we know about, doesn't look anything like the printed Chinese books. Now, in terms of my overall subject, there are several books in English. The book in Japan by Kornitsky, for example, is a very good book from 1998, although it does have a lot of material, as it should, about so-called Confucian learning, which therefore means he's not thinking as much about the Buddhist libraries the way we would think about the Christian libraries if we're thinking about Europe. On the Chinese, Japanese, Korean Buddhist canons, we have Wu Jiang and Lucille Jia spreading the Buddha's world in East Asia, the formation and transformation of the Chinese Buddhist canon, a group of books. We have Reinventing the Tripitaka, transformation of the Buddhist canon in modern East Asia. However, this is only about printed canons. What about manuscript canons? What about other books? And then, of course, on Chinese and Korean bibliographers, we have Tanya Storch's The History of the Buddhist Bibliography, Censorship and Transformation of the Tripitaka, which covers the catalogs. I'll mention those in a minute. And of course, we've got Richard McBride's Doctrine and Practice in Medieval Korean Buddhism that deals with Uichan's catalog, and we're going to be looking at him in a moment. So just a little bit of a review thinking about libraries and books in East Asia in English. Okay, there's some important starting points I want to make here. And the first thing is that when we think about Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Buddhism, we often talk about a shared language. And in English, we sometimes refer to this as Sinitic, okay? We don't call it Chinese. And I'm looking at the number of Zoom participants. That means I don't have my 350 in China that sometimes join. But this gets us into trouble in China, because when you see those things, Chinese characters, you're supposed to think China. But obviously, Japanese and Koreans, let alone Vietnamese, did not pronounce things as a Chinese person would, okay? They often would switch the order around, and so they would use the same language, but unlike with Latin, we don't see the immediate derivative of vernaculars. Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, obviously, are basically vernaculars of Latin. Nonetheless, Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans do share the canon, the Dazangjing, or the Daizokyo. Now, of course, in Japan, most of us are familiar with the Isaikyo, or the Ichijing, which is, of course, indexed, both of them, according to two catalogs only. The first one was compiled in 730. It's the Kaiyuan Lu, or the Kaigen Roku, and it has a very specific number of texts. And for those of you who know your Chinese Buddhist history in modern form, you know about the Journey to the West, the Xiyoji, with Tripitaka, who talks about going to India, and he finds exactly 5,048 Buddhist texts, okay? Then that comes out of this record. Here in Japan, a lot of research has shown that most manuscript canons are indexed according to the Zenyuan Lu, or the Jogen Roku, which is a little bit later and has a few more texts. For those of us who do Buddhist studies research, the next main thing we go to is actually the Showa Hobo Somokuroku, which was published in 1929 and is not online, to the best of my knowledge. But that's where the Taisho editors stuck almost every other important catalog they could find that comes after these from China and major libraries in Japan. So we're moving into Japanese libraries just on the canon. We also know that books, of course, were written by Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, some of which made their way into the canon, New Zhou. Mostly later in the Ming Dynasty, we get Chan books or Sun books or Zen books, however you want to refer to those. And of course, Professor Shina Koyu did amazing research. And of course, Yanagira Seizan and others were looking at this several decades ago. But let's be very clear, almost all of these books circulated in Japan a couple hundred years earlier in Zen temples, okay? And almost all of the so-called canonical books in the Taisho canon specifically the ones that are associated with Zen, were never ever in a canon. Most of them were never even in a Chinese printed canon, let alone the Jiaxing Zang. So it's a strange situation, even with regard to the canon, but we've already seen with our introduction, the books are in Japan, okay? Now, excluding those in the Showa Hoboso Mokuroku, those that are not catalogs to any libraries. These are not library catalogs. But in Japan, we do have library catalogs. We don't have any in China. We don't have any in Korea. But we have lots of libraries that tend to include a category of books called sacred teachings documents, shogyo, okay? Your bibliographers sometimes like to call this seikyo, maybe hijiri no hon or something. But anyway, shogyo, I think is the right pronunciation. Now, what have we learned in about a century? It's been about a century since the Taisho was compiled. And the question is, where are we with Buddhist studies research? Now, I'm showing you an actual paper edition of the Taisho, and I'm going to show you why in a moment. Just fun show of hands to make this interactive in the room. How many of you actually pick up a physical Taisho? Anybody? An actual book? Pick up the book? Maybe? Maybe not. Okay. Sometimes it's fun to go to the actual book, but what you're looking at here is something you won't see on SAT and you won't see on C-Beta, which is the long list of all the different abbreviations of what pop up showing you all the work that went into the Taisho, okay? 24 editions of books went into the Taisho, but it's based on the Koryo canon. Why? Because 19th century Japanese Buddhists started basing their own printed canon, the Shukusatsu, on the Korean canon. Not a Chinese canon, Korean canon. But do we have more books to investigate 100 years later? And if we do, where are the libraries? Now let me show you an example. My current research is obviously on libraries, and so we might ask a very simple question. Did Buddhist monks in ancient India have books? And did they have libraries? According to our friend Yi Jing or Gizhou, in his Nanhai Ji Guo Nei Fa Zhuan or Nankai Kiki Nai Ho Den, he tells us, quote, all the scriptures and commentaries after a monk is dead are not to be divided. So monks owned books, according to the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya in ancient India, and whatever books they had, you don't divide, but instead you preserve them for the common monks of the four quarters, and then you sell those for profit. So for those of you who know Gregory Chopin's work, this really rings a bell, okay? In other words, the economic side of ancient monasteries in India, according to the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. Notice on both sides of the screen, almost exactly the same text is in his Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya Sangraha translation that he stuck into his own record. So he's just borrowing, cutting and pasting. But for those of us that like SAT, there are footnotes. What do our footnotes tell us? I Ching did not call it a zokyo. He called it a kyozo. But during the Ming, they switched it. So they switched the actual name of a library in Chinese Buddhist canons in the middle of the 14th century, because they just did. And of course, we know also selling the books changed according to a palace edition and 3 other editions. So we actually know a lot about the text there, and we're just thinking about the Taisho. So obviously, when we think about the canon, we understand that Chinese, Japanese, and Korean share the canon, including the scriptures, the Vinaya, and the commentaries, translated from Indic languages into Chinese, and most traditions talk about transmission across India, China, and Japan. We should therefore be able to expect some correspondence between Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Buddhists across the Vinaya, for example. When we're thinking about Zen, we might think of the Shingi or the Qinggui, but we don't have to. And I want to make that very clear. As a historian, I don't think we have to. Perhaps if I were representing a particular Buddhist tradition, I might say should, okay? But I'm suggesting we don't have to see that. But it is only in Japan, from approximately the 12th century by the very latest, that nearly all Buddhist temple libraries had chests. By the way, they had chests long before that. But by the 12th century, they have lots of chests with lots of books that are not cataloged in the canon, but they are cataloged. So they've got chests with the canon, and they've got chests with other books, their own books that are also cataloged. That's the key. Those books are about what to study and what rituals to perform and how. We don't have those from China, and we don't have them from Korea. A lot of those deal with chanting, invocations, rituals to certain deities, masters, guidebooks, things like that. And I'm about to show you some really big lists that Professor Abe is going to go, oh yeah, I know this. Okay. We also should know that if we want to study the history of canons in the 21st century, someone did the work before the Taisho editors did. They just didn't thank him. And that's, of course, Ugai Tetsujo. And this is something I'm going to be picking up in the coming weeks. He, of course, did a lot of work looking for all the different canons in Japan, manuscript, printed, talked about the colophons, and very specifically, he's the one who gives us all the information about the Koryo canon. And Professor Baba Hisayuki has written a brilliant book talking about this. I don't know if you've ever seen scholars in English, including my great teacher, have suggested, oh, there's 1 or 2 Korean canons in Japan. No, there's like 30, okay? And they're almost all complete, including Kito no Tenmangu, just up the road. Okay, so when we think about canons, we know an awful lot just before the Haibutsu Kishaku time, when some books were destroyed, although certainly not most. And we know that in Japan, we had a lot of different canons circulating, but that's not the books I'm talking about. Now, just to prove my point in terms of the title, let's look very specifically at 11th and 12th century Buddhist temple library catalogs, okay? So in Song, China, we have catalogs to printed canons that primarily follow the Kaiyuan Lu, which I've already introduced. In Koryo, Korea, we have Uichun's Shin, Pyeon, Chejong, Chojong, Chongnak, which of course was preserved in Japan and indexes books he brought back from Song, China. Of course, it's not stuff in the canon, it's other materials. He compiled that around 1090. And then in Japan, we've got a lot of catalogs, and we're just talking about libraries. And I'm just going to talk about one. Eicho's Toiki Dento Mokuroku. Everybody in the room has seen this thing. It's a very standard catalog. And of course, it was compiled around 1094. My guess is it probably indexes the actual library of Kofukuji or a sub-temple. And I'm just going to very briefly talk about that. So Taisho volume 55, just volume 55 of our regular Taisho, lists a whole bunch of 10th and 11th century catalogs. And those are almost all the catalogs that Emperors Uda and Daigo told the monks they had to make. So it turns out in Japanese history, 2 emperors said, you have to make me a catalog. I need to know what books you have. And we think this probably happened because the monks who had gone to Tang, China, were told they had to catalog their books. And those catalogs are called Shorai Mokuroku, all right? What this means is that when Anen compiled all the 8 catalogs from all the Nito Hake, those are all the Shorai Mokuroku. Everybody else had to make their library catalogs too. Todaiji, Enrakuji, Miidera, Kongōji, Kofukuji, Tosho Daiji, etc. Most of these libraries got cataloged in some form or another. And of course, the 1790 edition of the Shoshu Shosho Roku is an example of this compilation. But thanks to tremendous work by Professor Abe and Professor Ochiai Toshinori, a number of years ago, we know that Shinpukuji, which is a very important Shingon temple in Nagoya, preserves several of these catalogs that are dated and take us right back to 914 and around 1077 with one of the earliest catalogs of Pure Land scriptures in Japanese history. The goal with this slide is to overwhelm you. We have no catalogs in China, and look what we've got in Japan, and we're just talking about the boring stuff. It's not boring, it's just not the monks' own books. These are the commentaries that come out of China, they come out of Korea, and they're written in Japan, okay? So commentaries to the Kegon-gyo, Hokke-gyo, things like that, okay? Yuishikiron, things like that, okay? All that good stuff. Now, we know that there were a bunch of libraries in 10th to 12th century Japan. For example, Hiei had several, the Shingonzo, the Sanozo, Miidera had a great catalog as of 891. We also, as I'm going to tell you in a moment, had another library that we know an awful lot about because of Anen and because of the catalog I was just talking about. And of course, we know that Toji already had a great library, Kongōji already had a great library, and Chusonji was developing a great library. So pausing for a moment, we're talking about a lot of libraries. One of those libraries, I think, gives us proof that we're looking at actual library catalogs, not indexing all the books in the land or all the books in the canon. And even the Taisho or Dainihon Bukkyo Zensho editions of Anensho, Ajari Shingon Mikyo Burui Soroku that I just mentioned, and of course, the Toiki Dento Mokuroku show you that both authors checked every single book against the library of Bonshakuji. Bonshakuji no longer exists, but it's there for everybody to see. I've published separately on this. There's even an edict in 834 in the Shokunihon Koki that suggests that every single Buddhist temple in the Kanto region had to check their own books according to the catalog of Bonshakuji. So one library was used to index all the libraries in Japan. I'm going to remind you, we don't have a catalog of a single library in China. Something's going on, okay? Edo period, of course, we've got some wonderful material coming out of Toji, and I'll make some references to this in a moment. Toji still has a magnificent library, but of course, many of the books were lost, as well as Enrakuji, needless to say. Now in China, we actually hear an awful lot about libraries. We just hear about these things. Revolving sutra bookcases or cabinets. Okay, this is of course one that's preserved over at Miidera, but actually Chinese sources have poems, diaries, all kinds of materials telling us about the great bookcase in the library. Qisong, for example, one of the most famous Buddhists in Song China, in his Tanjin Wenji, tells us specifically about visiting the gorgeous bookcase sutra library at 3 temples. And I'm giving you one reference here. A scholar I've worked on quite a bit, very important poet monk, Jiufan Huihong. I think I didn't get his Kakuhan. Sorry, it's not Kakumon. Gomenasai, Kakuhan. Anyway, there's another Kaku. Anyway, so Jiufan Huihong in his Sekimomoji Zen specifically has poems and references to all the cool sutra libraries, but he never mentions a catalog. Turns out, the mention of catalogs, we have to dig into the Shushu Tongjian, which would be the Shakushi Tsugan, which is a weird catalog comprehensive history following one of the most important histories ever produced in Chinese history. You can ask me about that in the questions if you want. That's Ouyang Shu. And so he actually lists in there, he tells us that there are 59 Buddhist books worth mentioning, of which he mentions one catalog specifically, which Yanagida Seizan pointed out exists only in a Tofukuji copy. The catalog's gone, but it's preserved in Japan. Something's going on here. Now, when we think of medieval Japanese temple libraries, that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. We know that libraries in China, I presume, in Korea, I also presume, but in Japan, I know, had 2 kinds of books. And those books were kept in chests, because if they're not kept in chests, bugs eat the books, right? Okay. One type of chest has the Daizokyo, or the Kyozo in it, all those catalogs that we just talked about, and the other chests have the Shogyo. Now, you don't just have to have religious books, you can have other books too. But we know that both sets of books were cataloged in Japan. As you would expect in any library, they need to have a catalog. And by 1769, an endpoint, we know that almost all Japanese Buddhist traditions use the term Shogyo, as in the Jodo Shinshu Shogyo Mokuroku that most of you are probably familiar with. So we see Shogyo as we move up into the Edo period, and certainly in centuries in between quite a bit. So this seems to be a very important term. And of course, we've got boxes, so we need to look at the boxes, okay? This, of course, is simply a newspaper print talking about a very important, probably Koryo sutra container that was found. And of course, we've got 1315 Chinese sutra container on the left that was preserved in Japan. We think it's Chinese. and then some regular ones that were found at a Jinguji in Chiba. So we got lots of sutra boxes. And again, I'm probably saying things that everyone here in Japan's like, ho hum, don't really care. But what would Chinese people do to be able to have a sutra box? Because then they could say, hey, wait a minute, there was a library, but not sutra boxes. Okay. They even have lids. Of course, got to keep the bugs out. Okay, where's the term shogyo come from and what does it mean? According to Nakamoto Hajime in Bukkyo Jiten, he says it comes from this. I'm not sure he's right, but for those of you who enjoy your Buddhist canons, you will see that this is the Nanatsudera Isai Kyo. And of course, you can't see this online. You actually have to go to the library in Tokyo that holds these. And of course, then you can have a picture and maybe you can scan that picture. But the point is, this is a preface that was stuck on most of Xuanzang's texts by a couple of different Tang emperors. It's lost in all the editions in the printed canons. Every single canon took it out. Don't need it because he's not the emperor anymore. But in Japan, they kept copying it. And in Dunhuang, they copied it. And it's not that exciting, but it does call Buddhism Shogyo. Okay? So maybe Shogyo are the books of Buddhism. Maybe. That's one argument. There's a couple other sources we have here, and there's a couple of other prefaces. Another one is by Tang Emperor Gaozong. And we need to remember that these books, this is Nanatsudera, canon, manuscript canon, copies of Tang manuscripts. There are many in Japan. There would have been more if Oda Nobunaga hadn't burned down the big temples, right? There were lots more. Okay, that's one of the reasons why Nanatsudera and Kongōji become so important. Here's one from Dunhuang, just to show you there's that congruence between Dunhuang texts and those manuscript canons. But again, I'm not really sure Japanese are thinking anything about China in terms of the Shengjiao. I don't think they're doing that. I think instead we have to look to the actual books in Japan. What are these sacred teachings documents? Now, Shingon, libraries, Toji, in particular the Kanchi in Kongōzo, Daikoji, Ninaji, Koyasan, Negoroji, Kongōji, Shinfukuji, Narita-san Shinshoji, Shomyoji in particular. These are the big libraries that some of you in this room know a lot about. And you're going, ho hum, I've heard of this before. Not a lot of people in English have paid much attention to this. Because here's the problem. These catalogs are not online. And I'm about to give you a little game to play. It's called guessing. One of the books I'm about to introduce is over a decade old. And until I walked into the library of this university, I had never gotten my hands on it. Because 5 libraries in Japan own a copy. That's it. And I even asked the professor for it, but he couldn't give it to me. Anyway, play a game and figure out if you can guess. So these are very hard to get a hold of catalogs. The work was done, but if you don't have circulating books, a theme, it's very hard. So between the 1980s and 2010, scholars in Japan cataloged mostly Shingon libraries, although not all of them are cataloged yet, and mostly in books, they're not digital. But there's a lot of work left to be done. Some scholars, Numoto Katsuaki, Kamikawa Michio, Professor Abe Yasuro, Professor Koto Akio, Yamamoto Nobuyoshi, and others have developed categories of Shogyo. Okay, so we don't have to guess what's in those boxes. We know what's in those boxes based on these catalogs. And Professor Abe is about to go to sleep because this is stuff he knows very well. So this is just a reference for those of you on Zoom who've never seen this before. Brian, I bet you've seen this many times. But this is work that was begun back in the 1980s, 1986 to be precise, and of course followed up in 1996. So we're not talking about cutting edge research here, but where we divide the Shogyo into different groups. We've got doctrinal study documents, Kyogaku, and then we've got ritual documents, historical documents, language study documents, transmission documents. Okay, in other words, they broke up all the Shogyo in the boxes. Category 1, doctrinal study. Hand-copied scriptures, printed scriptures, commentaries, the kinds of stuff I've been talking about for about 20 minutes stops there. Cursive debate texts, Professor Kusunoki here at Ryukoku University also works on that as well. Records of questions and responses, hand-copied notes, draft lectures, public religious lectures, written records of lectures, written records of lectures of what one has witnessed. We're not talking about esoteric Buddhism. We're talking about other kinds of things. Shortly, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to one example of what this would be. Ritual documents. I'm going to go fast here. This is the easy one, the stuff that's written down. The rest of it's written down to be recited. Obviously, when we see shidai, we mean instructions. Okay, Japanese does not do the same thing Chinese does here. In other words, one thing goes after the other. These are instructions. Okay. Ritual manuals, again, coming out of China. The C there tells you the language these are in. Is it in Sinitic, something like Chinese? Or are they going to gloss it with Japanese pronunciation? Or is it just written in Japanese? Okay, so that's what's going on there. Prescribed ritual instructions, preparation for ritual instructions, enlightenment experience instructions, detailed diaries and records. There ends the stuff that you're supposed to just read. Here's the stuff you're not supposed to just read. You're supposed to do. And this is just Shingon. Just Shingon. Probably Tendai also. What is recited in front of an altar or during an assembly or ritual? Obviously, hyobyaku, stuff like that. Vows, incantations for gods and deities, instructions for offerings like puja, kuyomon, selections from sutra or documents read for memorial purposes, sacred sounds or utterances done during rituals, chanting with ritual music, shomyo, very, very important category. Quote, Sanskrit chanting, get the Sanskrit sound through the Chinese. Sanskrit gatha, the verse in Sanskrit, another type of Sanskrit gatha, poem-like chanting. Eulogies that are gatha-like. Musical notation, regulations, lecture plans. Koshiki has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, especially when we think about koshiki for the gods, the kami-sama, okay? Lecture plans, again, registers of deceased people's names to be read aloud, register of Buddha's names to be recited, document for raising donations for temple construction projects. Not done. Historical documents, general historical documents, temple records, origin stories, lots to be made out of engi for scholars of Japanese literature, biographies, oral stories passed down, setsuwa, again, we have one of the world's foremost experts here in the room, chronicles, we have language study documents, sittam, jisho, dictionaries, and then we've got ongi. You want to see an ongi? That's an ongi from Kongōji. So in other words, the study of Sanskrit. We know they were doing it, notating it with the Chinese. You're all going ho-hum, this isn't very exciting. Actually, it should be, because it's showing you an awful lot about Japanese Buddhist libraries. We've also got documents, categories, stamp transmission documents, the kechimiaku, things like that. But notice we have a category for catalogs. We know that all of these things were cataloged, and they didn't have one type of catalog, they had many types of catalogs. They had the Shorai Mokuroku, they had the Kyozo Mokuroku. Then, of course, we have the transmission books, and then we've got the icon things. So we have lots of catalogs to a library, just as we would expect. We just don't have them in China or Korea. So when I promised you, I would tell you what we don't know about China and we don't know about Korea, I'm not done. But I'm just showing you the detail if you try to do this from a comparative perspective. And remember, Dento is a very important theme in Japanese Buddhism, transmission from China or Korea. Looks an awful lot like gishiki to me. Doing things, rituals, okay? Kata. So it would appear that Shingon and Tendai Shogyo address two things. Kyogaku on the one hand, and Jiso on the other, the rituals. And as you can see with the categories, we've got an awful lot of this. And a few scholars in English, specifically Brian Rupert and others, have looked at this. But the key point I want to make here is these are all for what to study. They're what your teacher tells you to study. They are an educational curriculum. They're also about the rituals you're supposed to do. They're the nuts and bolts of what you do as a Buddhist monk. We don't have these from China. We don't have them from Korea. And in Japan, they have okugaki. So we know who wrote them, who copied them, and who gave them to whom. Therefore, we're thinking about a textual or philological approach contrasted with a historiographical approach. I'm interested in both. So a history of books and manuscripts and things like that. My main question here is, how did librarians, scholar monks catalog and organize their libraries across time? That's what I want to see. But on the other hand, we can't ignore the contents of the texts that were used. And I'm going to talk briefly about that. And I was told to go for about 50 minutes, so we're going to keep it going for a while here. So, last question I want to highlight here is, what books did Buddhists use and how did they use them? We've now seen the categories. We need to see some examples. Now we're going to turn to Kongōji. Amanosan Kongōji is a very, very important temple everybody knows about. They just pretend they haven't. Okay? Back in the 1920s, the Tokyo Daigaku Shiryo Hensanjo already cataloged the Komonjo from Kongōji. So it's well known. It's not a lost library. Okay, and why did they do it? By the way, that's a picture of Yukoku's ancient books. Of course, you don't see these in a lot of places, and most of you know you can download the actual book today. Anyway, okay, but I figured I'd show you a fun book. Well, it probably happened, for those of you modernists in the room, they probably were looking at Kongōji because of the calligraphy that ties Kongōji and Kanshinji to Emperor Go-Daigo and Kusunoki no Masashige, which doesn't become a big deal until you get into the Meiji period, and all Japanese historians know why. Okay, so that's probably why everybody's looking at Kongōji. But the key thing is, they're not looking at the Shogyo, or are they? Now, what you're looking at here is basically a set of 5 books. That is the entire contents of the Kongōji library catalog. 2 were done under the auspices of Professor Ochiai Toshinori. And there's just a lot of information here because we're talking about grant projects. And what he did is he cataloged the entire manuscript canon and then some of the Shogyo. And then Professor Goto came back between 2000 up until 2011 and did the rest. Okay, so that's all we're looking at here. And remember that question I had: what book did the professor never see before he arrived in the Ryukoku library? Anyway, I brought one with me from Canada. The other one I was like, wow, that's cool. Anyway, these are gorgeous. They're almost impossible to get your hands on, and they're not online. Also, 5 volumes from Kongōji's Shogyo have been published. They're in the library here. They're remarkable, and they deal with some subjects. We're talking about a tiny sliver of books out of Kongōji, and the publications are gorgeous, and I'm going to show you one. Okay, where is Kongōji? You're all going, everybody visits Kongōji. Well, it's obviously a very important temple in southern Osaka, not too far from Negoroji, or it was on the old road to Koya. And we know that most of what I'm talking about, and I'm interested in at this stage, is monks were studying a lot of things for a transmission assembly, the Dembo-e. Now, the history of the Dembo-e is something that's complex, and I'm not going to go too far into, but it takes us into the history of Negoroji, Koya-san, and medieval Japanese Buddhist Shingon Fan. That being said, nonetheless, the books at this temple were used for Kyogaku, scholastic learning, as well as ritual training at that temple, not at Koya, not at Negoroji, not at Kanshinji, they didn't go somewhere else to study. They did it there. A temple most of us haven't heard of unless we're Kusunoki no Masashige fans. What we know is this is a very large network of Shingon temples. Most of the libraries I've already mentioned here. Most of the books seem to have circulated around these different libraries. But the key point here is that Shinpokuji and Kongōji have most of the oldest books. Why? If this were an interactive session, everybody would put their hand up and tell me, because people burned books. Oda Nobunaga, it's not just him, other people did it too, okay? Books were lost, insects ate them, things happen to books. What is a good question though is, why weren't Shinpokuji's books destroyed, or Amanosan Kongōji? What happened? Why were they prepared? That's a question in my research. Turns out Kongōji and Kanshinji are becoming much more well known. For those of us in Kyoto, there's about to be a gorgeous exhibit at the Kyoto National Museum dealing with some of the treasures from Kongōji and Kanshinji, both, although Kanshinji does not have the kinds of texts we do here. So I'm just going to very quickly spend about 10 minutes going over the two examples of the kinds of material I have been working at from Kongōji, okay? Catalogs are the biggie, and that's something I'm moving much further into. And when we look at catalogs, we're looking at catalogs by a particular monk. His name is Zenne, who made catalogs of shogyo. Now, if you're going to catalog all the shogyo, the first thing you do is you need a catalog. So you take Kukai's Shorai Mokuroku and you use it as a list. And you go through your library and you check it all off. I've got this, I've got that, I've got this, I've got that, I've got this. Then you make a catalog that tells you what you don't have. That's important too. The stuff I do have, the stuff I don't have. Remember, this is not the stuff that's in the Buddhist canon. This is stuff Kukai brought back, and then my teacher's 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 teacher gave it to me. So I got to have it, and I need to catalog it. And then we also have this very interesting catalog, the Hongyo Giki Mokuroku, which would be moving in the direction of cataloging some of the ritual stuff, not necessarily the doctrinal learning. All I'm showing you here is a lot of information on the colophons. In other words, we know the history of these books, we know who copied them, where they came from, and a little bit more. We also have a very important catalog of printed books. We all know about printed books in Japan. They don't get enough coverage in the history of printing at all. But here we have a catalog of 1323. Zenne is telling us all the printed books he's got from Mount Koya. And of course, this would be in direct opposition to China. In Japan, you print stuff you want. You don't print stuff you don't want. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with the Buddhist canon, but you print the books you use because you need lots of copies. You don't print the Buddhist canon until much later. That's the history of Japanese libraries. We have lots of examples of what was published, but just here's a quickie. We've got Yixing's Dainichi Kyosho, for example. We've got Zhiguang's Shitanjiki. And we've got Kukai's Sango Shiki. These are study books that we print and then we bring over and then we tell we've got the copies. So these are basically your university level textbooks, okay? We obviously also remember we have Kasugaban that also does this. This is Kofukuji. We also have Senyuji. We also have Chionin. Lots of people are doing printing in Japan. This would take us into the world of shogyo that expands, because we have printed shogyo and manuscript shogyo. Obviously, we know this one, simply Kasugaban, very well known. This would be this is the Shinshorai Kyoto Mokuroku. This is a wonderful text, but the reason I show it here is it's got reading marks. Why? Because Japanese people need reading marks. That's a good thing, not a bad thing, okay? We don't read boyomi. We need to know what things are. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about is an example of what do you study. And this is going to hurt a little bit as we move into the end of the talk, okay? Because we don't just think about Buddhism on a broad scale. We think about what book do we study. In the Shingon tradition, we study Kakuban and Ryu's interpretations of the Shi Mohuyen Lun, or the Shakumakaen Ron. This is a very important commentary understood to be a commentary to a very important Buddhist text called the Awakening of Mahayana Faith, the Dashang Qixin Lun, or the Daijo Kishin Ron. It's supposed to be a commentary. Now, remember, I am a historian. Historians say it's fake. It's fake. It's fake, not Indian. So did they. That's what you're about to learn. They studied that it was fake. That was part of their educational curriculum. Now, they also studied commentaries to deliver lectures on the Hokkei-kyo, the Konko-myo-kyo, and the Dainichi-kyo. That shouldn't surprise us. Everybody did that in medieval Japan. So that's another subject for another day. Got teaching materials on that. The primary sources we're thinking about here are Kukai's commentary to the Shakumakaen Ron, Kakuban's commentary to the Shakumakaen Ron, Ryu's commentaries. Okay, so we've got multiple lists of all your teachers' commentaries. And then we've got more of my teachers' commentaries at my temple. That's where we introduce our friend Aban. He wrote the Shaku Ron Shoshutsu. Doesn't exist anywhere outside of Kongōji because it's not for monks outside of Kongōji. Remember at the top, I told you I was going to talk about Japanese temple, library history. This is it. It's not at Negoroji. It's not at Koya. It's not at Toji. They don't need a copy. Only Kongōji needs a copy. Okay. By the way, I could be wrong. Maybe Shinfukuji has a copy too, but nonetheless, I have to check. Point is, Zenne in the 14th century also talks about all of this in his own copy of a very interesting book called the Ryuron Sho, which is, of course, Nagarjuna. The Ryu is Nagarjuna, Naga. It's his treatise, and it's all about how fake the book is that everybody's written a commentary to, because we need to know that. Okay, this is simply a quick list of all the different teachers at Kongōji. Akan, for example, the founder, Kakushin, Shoson, Sonkyo, Kakujitsu, Aban. He's got a cool name, doesn't he? Aban. Kakuben as well, all the way down. There's a list that Professor Akatsuka has produced all the way up until the 19th century. That's how detailed the list of scholar monks at Kongōji is. Now, when we talk about these colophons, we're looking at something very specific. We're talking about the Shinpitsu. Okay, Brian Rupert wrote about this a number of years ago. It's a true handwriting copy of my teacher's text. It's back to that lineage issue. Of course, for Zenne, it's his teacher Yoden going back to his teacher. You can just say teacher B, teacher A, and teacher B. And then he goes to all this information in just one of the examples, and then my other example down below is a little different. But in either case, notice that we have Jiji, Shohon. So I'm not copying a fake book, I'm copying the real thing. This is Shogyo. There's a textual history and it has a very detailed depth. And I'm only talking about textual materials. Okay. Obviously, we all know that the Ryuron Sho tells us that the Shakumaka is fake. It talks about how it comes from Korea. Jinchong, the great monastery, reports that Runchung apparently got a copy of this thing. This is in the text that the monks at Kongōji studied. Then the same book tells us that it was brought to Japan before 778. It got to Daionji. People had arguments over it because they said it was fake. So we know it's a fake book. Why are we studying it? Because apparently Jesus is in 14th century southern Osaka prefecture. Now, the Ryuron Sho is a gorgeous edition. It's in one of those, obviously, I couldn't have studied it. It wasn't published elsewhere. It's a relatively short manuscript. Zenne signs it, and of course, he probably didn't compose it. We don't think he did, but he definitely gives us a nice colophon where he signs it. One line usually has 17 Sinitic logographs, so it's not very long. And it's basically maybe a debate text, but it goes through and explains some basic themes about the Shakumaka and Ron, and then it talks about how it's fake. Okay. They're all getting feedback. You guys okay? You can still hear me, right? Put your thumbs up. Yes. Okay. Okay. So we're talking about just some examples of how fake it is. All right. So Anen thought it was fake. It was a Giron. Then there's a discussion of Nagarjuna as a specious author. He didn't write it. Then there are some quotes from Goho's Hosakusho, his commentary. And then we've got Saisen's commentary. And then where they say, oh no, it's real because it has Empress Wu Zhao characters in it. So it must be a real Chinese text. And then Saisen is quoted saying, actually, I think it came from Central India. And then the text goes on and says, nah, actually, Zoshun in his Dai Sho says it's fake. So this is a text about authenticity. Some of us care a great deal because we think about the authenticity of Buddhist texts. Did they come from India? Did they come from China? As historical scholars. The great Makita Tairyo at Kyodai spent a lifetime looking at this. We're talking about a 14th century text that shows you Japanese Buddhists did this, and they looked at the proof, pro and con, to have a debate. They also look at the Enrakuji Soroku about this, the record of Kaimyo arguing it's dubious. Then they look again at Anen Sho Ajari Shingon Mikyo Burui Soroku and said, hey, it's fake. Not that it's fake, but this particular text. And then they asked, well, I don't know, then how come Ryu copied it? Then how come Aban copied it? And then it gives a list of 50 different Shingon monks who copied it. And then it introduces a couple of texts I've never heard of. I've looked through Chinese databases, the Wakan Nendai Sho and the Wakan Nendai Sho. Both of them seem to suggest this thing circulated in China. There are books in Japanese libraries Chinese scholars have never heard of. One of them suggests it circulated under the reign of Emperor Huizong in Song, China. And the other one, Liang Yuandi, did. Either way, we're looking at school, an educational curriculum. The point of all of this is very simple, and I'm just going to conclude. We know a tremendous amount about Japanese libraries. We know a tremendous amount about a small number of Japanese libraries. And if we can take that information and start to then compress it, condense it, and cross-reference it, we can talk about doctrinal study, we can talk about ritual study and developments over time, and we can start to take seriously the idea that Buddhists don't just study stuff translated in India. Of course they don't. They also write their own books, they read their own books, and they practice their own rituals, and they write that stuff down. I'm going to go ahead and guess that they did in China, and they did in Korea too. I don't think all of that information would have been lost over time, but that's something to think about going forward. But I hope at the very least I've given you some things to think about, and maybe it's worth a trip down to gorgeous Kongōji. By the way, to the left and to the right of this wonderful stupa are where all the books are supposed to be kept. I'm not sure how you keep 60 chests in that tiny little building just of Shogyo, but maybe they do. Thank you very much.